more than 100 unique styles of beer, each with their own set of ingredients, process, guidelines, history, and experience. If you're a beer lover, an industry leader, or somewhere in between, a better knowledge of beer style will improve your life and your work.
Welcome to A Sense of Beer Style, essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. I'm Julia Herz.
And I'm Jeremy Storton.
We're advanced Cicerones, beer judges, home brewers, and we're excited to guide you through the vast and wonderful world of beer styles.
Well, hi, everyone. Hi, Julia.
Hello.
Today, we're going to talk about a beer style. This one is a little bit tricky because not only is it really hard to find, especially these days, I haven't seen one in years, to be honest. It was extremely popular in 2017, 2018. We're recording this in 2023. You may be listening to this in 2024 or 2030. We don't know. But the thing is, this beer made a huge impact, and then suddenly disappeared. And of course, we're talking about the Brut IPA. So what is a Brut IPA? Let's start with that. A Brut IPA was really meant to be kind of like a spritzy, wine-like IPA. It was meant to be, as best as I understand it, it was meant to be a reaction. Keep in mind, 2017, we had spent the early 2000s in the hops arms race, where the more bitter, the better it was, right? And then all of a sudden we discovered that hops have a beautiful flavor. And so now we have hazy IPAs and milkshake IPAs, and we swung completely on the other end of the spectrum, where it was a kinder, gentler IPA nation. But there were still people that are like, hey, I still like my hoppy, bitter beers. So how can we make it even more so and kind of have an IPA for everyone? That's kind of how it felt like the Brut IPA was for me. Did you get the same idea on that one, Julia?
Yeah, and then life is cyclical too, so it
Yeah.
could come back in force. Who knows? I thought it showed a lot of prowess of the beer world's ode to the wine side of things.
Yeah.
I think it's funny that was an IPA counterbalance to IPAs, right? So that's why we're in specialty IPA with Brut IPA as the style instead of just brut beer, because there's other examples that are brut for beer.
Yeah.
But this is IPA centric when you talk about Brut IPA, and it was the counterbalance to those kind of hoppy, bitter West Coast IPAs.
Yeah. And just to be clear for anyone listening, so Brut is a wine term or a champagne term meant to indicate dryness. So you have Brut, semi-Brut, and all that sort of stuff. So this was really meant to be a clean, bone dry IPA. So that's kind of the background. This also came out of San Francisco. I believe it came from the Social Kitchen in San Francisco is kind of where it originated. But it took on a life of its own, and every brewer made a Brut IPA and a hazy IPA. It just, as time has told us, that the hazy IPAs kind of won out in popularity, and the Brut IPAs have kind of relegated themselves into the guidelines in a historical sense. So maybe they'll come back, maybe they won't. We'll find out. But we're here to talk about the Brut IPA today. So that being said, let's start with the ingredients. That's a really kind of, the ingredients and the process was interesting on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. And you are right that Kim at Social Kitchen, who was the brewer, and that brewery's opened, I believe, in 2010, really experimented their way into this style. And the style isn't your classic malt base for Pilsners either, right? It might have been actually the introduction to India Pale Lager or other style Pilsners that are very hoppy, like the hoppy, lagers. It could have been. Now that I think about it, bit of a revelation today. Got to chase that one down. But the classic ingredients, it could have been classic ingredients. So Pilsner malt, that's what it leads with, or very pale malts. Typically, American IPAs will absolutely be pale malt based, maybe some crystal malt, etc. But this leads with Pilsner, and then some pale malts, and then 40% up to adjuncts. They emphasize in the style guidelines that you're not going to allow, lactose or certain types of malt that are really not intended for the flavor profile that this style gets at. And then the key ingredient is an enzymatic addition of amylglucidase, and that enzyme is what's traditionally used in bigger stouts and other types of things that frankly makes the sugars more accessible for the yeast to be able to kind of bite off and chew and consume them, thus lower residual sugar in the finished beer compared to normal IPAs or other specialty IPAs, thus a drier beer. Thus the Brut concept that Jeremy was talking about. Brut meaning dry, Brut meaning champagne-like. And many champagnes are, 0.999 gravity with zero residual sugar. These don't always land there, but when we get to the statistics, that's a starting point.
I was just thinking the same thing. Those are fun.
Yeah, it's an end point for the final gravity. Yeah.
And it was kind of I love the style, which, it's a very cerebral style for me. And I just kind of geeked out on the idea that we could use this enzyme to help attenuate the beer further, as if we introduced Brettanomyces without the Brettanomyces funk of the beer. So it really was kind of like a similar experience for me anyway.
I like that notion, and we're still in the middle of talking ingredients, but let's riff on that, because when you add Brettanomyces, which is a wild style yeast, it actually means British fungus, Brettanomyces. It's not an ale yeast, it's not a lager yeast, it's its own wild yeast. That yeast, Brett, will eat commonly sugars that are not accessible to your standard Saccharomyces yeast.
Yeah,
so
big chain dextrins.
So I think it's very fair that you brought that up. Now, moving on from the enzymatic help with this Brut style, the style guidelines kind of talk about, oil-laden, heavy, modern American New World hops for a lot of late hopping. That's very classic of American IPA. So that's kind of an ode to the IPA style of things. And then you get lots of hop, not just bitterness by the boiling hops, but aroma and flavor. And then the yeast is more of a neutral ale yeast. If you go to the lager style Saccharomyces yeast, I'd be surprised. I'm not saying it's not being done, but normally just kind of a neutral, approachable, more pedestrian ale yeast.
Yeah, for sure. But appearance-wise, we can talk about that one. From what I remember, and of course what the guidelines share, it was a very, very pale straw, maybe up to light gold-colored beer. It was brilliantly clear. I've seen some, and it even says you can have just a little bit of haze, but for the most part, they were pretty darn clear to absolutely clear. But these beers usually poured with just this beautiful, just foam, just this rocky foam that looked like mousse. That was, like good '90s style cappuccino foam. That beautiful looking foam that would just persist for days. That's what I remember from these. That's what the guidelines still kind of shares. That's kind of what you can expect from the Brut IPA. Let's talk about the aroma.
So aroma, as we were talking about with the hop additions, late hop additions, you're going to have moderately high to intense hop aroma. That makes sense, especially for an IPA, even though this one's a specialty version. American and New World hops are going to give you different types of flavors that would be used, or forgive me, different types of aroma that would be used. But you're looking for that kind of classic American tropical citrus type of not grassy or vegetal type of aroma from the hops. And that's very pleasing. When it goes to vegetal, onion, garlicky too oily, it's just not where you want the aroma. The malt's not as prominent as the hops in this, a little bit more in the background. You can have some caramel notes, actually, and that's fairsies. I would think that would be coming from any addition of extraneous specialty malts that you might have used. And you are going to get, some ethanol, but not over the top, needs to be clean, not big slap in the face of that alcohol. And then fermentation character from that ale yeast is not supposed to bring or intended to bring a lot of fruity esters or phenols. It should be a clean, neutral ale yeast with not a lot of influence on the aroma.
Yeah. When we think about what it tastes like, again, this was all about the hops. And so when we think about what this beer is like, what does the malt have to say? It's a very low, very low to low neutral, subtle malt. It provides just this foundational layer and nothing more, not really. It even talks about without any strong flavors, definitely no caramel, no character, nothing that you can really discern unless you're paying really, really close attention and you've had some flavor training. Uh, but when we get to the hops, then of course now we're talking from high to very high hop flavor. Now here's a part that I'm a little that kind of challenges me a little bit. They talk about very low to low bitterness. Part of it is the ones that I had, and granted it's been a while, and I was just become a certified Cicerone when these started proliferating in the market, and they were new beer, and so I'm tasting them. Uh, I remember some of them being quite bitter, but that is just a memory, and maybe I have it wrong. But so you'll have to decide. I remember them being quite bitter, but they talk or the guidelines suggest that these are very low to low bitterness, and then they also tag on to due to very dry finish and high carbonation. This is where I want to respectfully challenge that because for me, a dry finish and high carbonation potentiate the bitterness to my palate. So, for those of you who are out there listening and are thinking about this, I respectfully disagree with the guidelines on this one. They may be kind of a lower on the bitterness scale and very high on the hop flavor scale. But if it's dry, if it's carbonated, that's going to give that perceived bitterness a little bit more oomph to it, from my experience. So that being said, there's also you can get some fruity esters in there. We are using hops; you'll get some fruity esters from those, but it should be low at the most. The way that they brew this with ingredients, it could have diacetyl from the nature of it, but this beer should not have any diacetyl. So if you do get a hold of one of these and you detect diacetyl, they didn't finish it. They didn't get the job done completely. So it should not have diacetyl, even though this beer wants to make diacetyl. But then we kind of talked about this a minute ago. It should be a dry to very dry finish. This is light and easy on the palate, and so there's a little bit of a conversation here when the flavor goes, as far as the flavor goes. But let's jump into mouthfeel. That should be a little bit more of a slam dunk.
And it's interesting. I always have trouble with the style guidelines because you've heard me say this before. If you
Hmm.
listen to our show, that flavors three things. It's a fusion of aromatic compounds, basic
Hmm.
taste, and mouthfeel. And the way the BJCP style guidelines listed and emphasize dry to very dry finish, that's in the flavor. But then they also have a whole section for mouthfeel. So the point that Jeremy's mentioning tied to the style guidelines is it means dry to very dry finish, meaning not high or having much residual sugar at all.
Hmm.
That's the residual sugar piece because we taste the sugar as a basic taste. Then you get to mouthfeel, and it talks about the body. Mouthfeel and body go hand in hand. Dry finish really is alluding to the residual sugar. So light to very light body, spritzy carbonation. They reference kind of like a sparkling white wine kind of thing. That totally makes sense. Very nuanced. This is not a rustic beer. This is nuanced. You won't want no strong hop astringency, no harsh bitterness, but you have bitterness that might be detected in reasonable levels. And then the alcohol warmth would be there, but again, not barreling you over, not dominant, and not sharp and bitey.
Yeah. When we talk about style comparisons, obviously we can compare this to its relative base beer, which is an American IPA. And so the Brut IPA, by the nature of what we've just been talking about, is it ought to be less malty. It ought to be a paler in color, and less bitterness than an American IPA. With a kind of a flavor profile that's reminiscent of a hazy IPA, just with the tropical fruits, but it's very different beer, but they're just making those comparisons. I thought this was interesting. The guidelines also suggest a comparison to a Belgian Golden Strong, not in flavor and anything else, but it was similar in the fact that it's pale, it's highly carbonated, and a bit on the dry side, like a Belgian Golden Strong, or I call them a BGS. Another beer that I was thinking about the whole time looking through this that is not listed is, to me, it's kind of reminiscent of an Australian sparkling ale, But where the Brut IPA has very low yeast character and higher hop character, and Australian Sparkling Ale has more yeast character and lower hop character, but they're both light. They're both pale. They're both kind of finish a little bit on the dry side. And so I thought there was an interesting comparison there too, just to play around for those who want to have a discourse while drinking whatever happens to be in your glass. But that's the style comparison. We can talk about the commercial examples if we can still find some.
Yeah, and it is exciting because California Drake's Brewing Company, when you look them up, they still list it. I'm sure it's still sold. It's prominently on their website. So Drake's Brightside Extra Brut IPA is a good example that is regularly referenced. You've got the Brut Squad, Omegang Brewing, Brut IPA, which I would love to come across. Those beers are amazing. Fair State, who I do not come across often, but certainly hear about them. Brewing Co-op, the Brut Squad. So I just talked about the Brut Squad, but it's part of Fair State Brewing Company's co-op. And so there are some out there. And Social Kitchen is not listed. We'd all have to go to San Francisco to see the originating brewery's beer, assuming that that is still being made and the brewery is still in production.
And frankly, and I may not have my information right, but I believe I heard that closed. So please, someone put a comment in the chat below the video or send an email. I'd like to know for sure, but I believe I heard it was closed.
And that's fair to have us not be in every nook and cranny of the universe. And I would say Sense of Beer Style community can help us too. So yeah, please do let us know. And then we are all informed. And from there, Jeremy, let's take us through some statistics, or have you take us through some statistics.
Yeah, so let's talk numbers. This is the story gets interesting here. I'm just going to start out with alcohol, the ABV. This one really lives firmly in IPA land. Again, for those of you who've listened to a few of these, I like to look at these in a visual format, and I created a visual format to help myself study and kind of see the patterns here. This one follows the pattern really well, 6 to 7.5 for IPAs. And IBUs, this is the part that's interesting. 20 to 30. This is an IPA with IBUs of 20 to 30. That's definitely noteworthy and definitely memorable for those who have to study this, because that breaks the pattern in a very, very big way. And when we start talking about color, we talked about the ingredients are very pale, maybe light gold, but that puts us in 2 to 4 SRM or 4 to 8 EBC. When we're talking about the original gravity and the original Plato, it's all going to follow that ABV. We're looking at 1046 to 1057, but even that doesn't quite tell the story of the ABV. Usually, the original gravity puts you in the ballpark of ABV, but notice the numbers are very different. That's because this beer is over attenuated and is dropping below a normal beer standard. So we're getting a little bit more alcohol oomph for the buck on this one. And that's because of those extra enzymes that they add in there. For the Plato, we're looking at 11.5 to 14 for the original. But this is where it gets really, really fun. The final gravity can be 0.990 up to 1.004. That is dry as a bone, people. The only other beer that I can think of off the top of my head that can possibly drop below 1.000 is the American Light Lager. This is dry as a bone. It doesn't get any drier. It's like you have to drink some water afterwards just to get some wetness back in your mouth. Final Plato's for everyone who speaks Plato. We're talking a 0 to 1 is really what it comes out to. And if you're thinking about alcohol in terms of Plato, that really puts us in 11.5 to 13. But these numbers, if you have to memorize this stuff, these numbers, they don't tell the same story. It's interesting, it's heady, it's cerebral, and it ought to be memorable for those who have to memorize it. So, but I'm already bored with numbers. Let's talk about glass and temp.
Nope. Great job taking us through. Numbers are boring, or you can force yourself in your mind to think they're exciting, because if you have to study them, you got to think of something to keep you interested. And I do think the disconnects, at least on paper, are telling based on the ingredients and the coaxing of those enzymes to create a drier beer. So I love what you just described. And talking about glassware and temperature, we are now doing, and we're in the thick of multiple specialty IPA shows here at Sense of Beer Style. And I do feel that IPAs served cold are fabulous. I don't want them warmer cellar temperature as you would have English ales or the like. I want 38 degrees Fahrenheit. And I think what's really important here is the glassware that would help you. And so I happen to have some beautiful glassware
look at those.
that you could consider. And, this one's really not even a champagne glass. This is more a port or sherry glass. But look at that sexy long, stem that you hold onto the foot. And then this one is more champagne style. And the reason that these are here is you want to coax out that carbonation and create that even further drying and refreshment factor by really concentrating out the carbonation towards the opening of the actual glass. So I'm going to recommend champagne style glassware. You can also go with, kind of modified Pilsner style glassware and the like. But something that is meant to have beers in it that are more carbonated is what I would be after, and also serving it cold.
Yeah. When it comes to pairing, I want to thank Contrast. This beer is such an impact in one direction. I want some food to kind of go the opposite direction to kind of bring me back to center. And for me, that's like a creamy pasta Alfredo. I think this would be fantastic with a buttery, sweet seared scallop, maybe some herbed cheesy bread. But really, with a beer like this and what it was meant to be, I don't necessarily need food with it. This could be the perfect aperitif, something to drink in one of Julia's fancy glasses to drink to stimulate your appetite, to stimulate your palate, and get ready for the next courses that are yet to come. That would be a perfect use for this beer.
I like it, Jeremy, and I'll round it out that I tend to want, I think of my stepmom as I was growing up, and she'd always kind of have a champagne cocktail, and they'd put a little a raspberry syrup into the champagne. It would create a nice, beautiful color from that golden color, then turning it to red. And so I tend to want, sparkling white wines and champagne with fruit in it. So some kind of fruit dish, like literally fresh fruit drizzled with the lightest of agave or honey, and see where that goes, all the way to certain types of pies that have the red fruits. I'm not after the stone fruits. I'm after blackberries, raspberries, boysenberries, and the like. And that's what I'm craving. And the counterbalance of the malted barley, I think will do it well, and the dryness factor of the beer. So it's more of a contrast pairing approach to me, but I also love what you suggested.
Yeah. And if you drizzle a little bit of white chocolate over those berries too, I wouldn't wag a finger at you for sure.
That wouldn't hurt. It wouldn't hurt at all.
Yeah. Anyway, that is Brut IPA. It is something to understand, appreciate, study. But at least for now, we may have seen the rise and fall of it, and we will see what the future holds for this beer style. But it is definitely interesting nonetheless. So thank you for listening.
Yes, and find one. If you do find one, well, you go out and find one. And if you do find one, covet it, drink it, buy more, share it, and then that way it keeps this style alive. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to A Sense of Beer Style, the essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. With advanced Cicerones, me, Julia,
and me, Jeremy.
Tune into the next episode as we continue exploring the world of beer styles and what to make of them. We encourage you to listen to the prepisodes to build your foundation and better understand beer styles.
And before the next episode, I'd like to ask you to review the show and let us know what you'd like featured in upcoming episodes. Until next time, here's to you and your sense of beer style. Thank you for listening. Cheers.